I'm from a very large family. There were 11 children, and my grandmother had 2 children, and my aunt also had 11 children. So we always act like we were one family, and especially on rainy days, my uncle would always tell us these stories about the hag, Hanson Plat, and he seemed as though he knew exactly when it was going to have a big flash of lightning, and then he would talk about the hag and its skin. And these are the things that I remember. And of course, the other thing was, I was always happy. You're always happy when you got an opportunity to go to Sunday school and church. So we did that frequently. And it was always in church, we liked going to church because people sang, and then you wanted to know who was going to do the best shout. And then we also had a prayer hall in Georgetown. It's for some reason people don't realize, but you had prayer halls in Georgetown. We have 2 that are still standing on the west side. And these prayer halls they used them like during the week and not on Sunday. And you went there and they would just sing and pray and shout and so forth. And like some of my friends that my age, and we usually say, oh, we learned how to clap and sing and shout at the prayer hall. One is located on Gilbert Street. That was the Israelite Society. And the other one is located out on Palm Street. And I could remember, they just had wooden benches, and they seemed like they were very, very hard. And they didn't do that much sitting there because it was just a time of praising and singing and shouting and whatnot. So you were standing most of the time in the prayer halls. The children sat on the benches, or sometimes we would get tired and we'd go to sleep. And Sheila still has the bell that the Israelite Society used to let people know it's time, because if you could, at that time they would ring the bells, the church and the prayer hall, so you know it's time. You had at least 10 minutes to get there. They're going to be starting the meeting. We still do it today. I have a prayer group that I'm involved in on Wednesdays, and we start with a devotion, and after devotion, someone will just raise a song, and then you would get up and you testify, and you tell everybody how good God is to you and everybody else. And then we pray for not just your family, we pray for everybody in the whole wide world, and we still do it to this day. It isn't in the prayer hall, but you'll have these prayer meeting, and this is what we usually do in prayer meeting. And at St. John Church is at 12 o'clock on Wednesdays. Not at 12 o'clock, it's at about 10:35 to 11. So sometime we come a little late, but it might have started already, and that person would raise a song, and they would do their testimony, or they will go and pray. You could do either one. If you're doing a testimony, you just stand. But if you're going to pray in the Methodist church, what we do, we have an altar, so we go to the altar. But you always raise a song, okay? So you wait when that person finishes. It's just one of those things, just continue. Well, on Butt Street, we actually had Mr. Robert Jennings, and he owned the cab company. So we always had cars on Butt Street. And we also, well, this was the 30s and the 40s, was Mr. Dan Reed. And Mr. Dan, he was in real estate, and then Mr. Dan had a horse and a wagon. So those type things. And I think I started remembering cars probably in the late 40s and the 50s. They had few cafes, but your parents really didn't take you to a cafe, because you would most of the time we would go there for dancing. We had 2 of them on Hawkins Street, and then we had at least 2 on Butch Street, and we had one. It's practically all of the street had a cafe, and or they had stores where you could go and buy things. And a lot of times they would sell food like hot dogs, chili dogs, French fries, or something like that. Now the restaurants were downtown, Georgetown, and at that time we couldn't go in the restaurant because blacks were prohibited. And I remember when we started, I left Georgetown in '56 to go to college, and that's when they were doing an awful lot of demonstrating and whatnot. And we came back to Georgetown on vacation, and we had a demonstration at Rose's 5 and 10. I did not demonstrate, but a lot of us who could not demonstrate, because at South Carolina State, if you were caught doing any of those things, you were expelled from school. So what we did, we worked, like I said, underground. We helped to organize it. When the kids came to, when I came to Georgetown, what I did, I had 2 shirts, sweatshirts that says, T-shirts that South Carolina State. So I gave them my shirt. And then number 1, I said, why would I want to go and sit next to those people if they don't want me to sit next to them? So I was always a little proud, so I didn't think it was, the food wasn't worth that much at Rose's 5 and Dime. And then all of those other places that we couldn't eat. When I see people now talk about all of these places, Thomas and Cafe and the Lafayette and Whistle and Pig and all those places, we could not go. And if you went there, what you did, you had to go around the back to buy. And I refused to go to the back of the place to purchase anything. So I never really got to go to any so-called restaurant in Georgetown. And to this day, I have never been in Thomas' restaurant. Even when that Lafayette restaurant was there, I will not go into it. Saturday was a big day for us. All of us went to the movies. And my mother would let us go to the movie, and you stayed all day, even though the movie was segregated. Now, I'd like for you to take a picture of the Strand, the front of the Strand Theater. In the front of that Strand Theater, you have a door on the side, and that door went up where the African American had to sit. We had no restrooms up there at all, and it was very dark. There were 2 theaters, the Palace and the Strand Theater. When I came home and I went to a couple of plays, and they said, would you like the balcony? And I said, hell no. I said, I had enough of that balcony. But no lights. And you can imagine if you wanted to go to the bathroom, you had to come all the way and go outside and find a place around there. So, but the theater was just great because I think that all of us just thought about wanting to act, you know, so you would go. But in the meantime, was one family. We had 2 black theaters on the west side of Georgetown. One was located, the building is torn down now, the one was located on Emmanuel Street, and the other one was located at someone's home on Butch Street. It was a 2-story family, and we would see, and this was really very inspirational to us because we saw black movies, and they weren't negative movies. So, but the thing about it, they didn't show the cowboys. That's why we went to the one for the Strand Theater, because they left you with a cliff. You know, at the end, just before the end of it, someone was just about to go over the cliff or whatever, and then you'd have to go back next week, because then they said, will be continued next week. And we would stay there like half a day. My father was an excellent cook. So we had right, yeah, Daddy made the best gravy, the best whipping grits gravy. And he made an effort to give us at least 1, 2, or 3 meals from out of the creek every day. So we had excellent seafood, and he was an excellent cook. And sort of running my family. My brother was a chef, and I have nephews and so forth. and other male cousins that were chefs and very good cooks. We had an excellent elementary school system. Where I went in second grade, it's Kehoe, it's the Dream Keepers Museum. I went there in second grade, and at one time we had a very long building, because a lot of times people, and especially the rural area, had a one-room school, but not Georgetown. I went to a brick building. That building was either torn down or was burned down, I don't know, after the civil rights, so I don't know. The building isn't there anymore. But we had excellent teachers, and I didn't realize how the teachers, how good they were, and the school, until I went to teach in the Boston school system. And I could compare what the children were learning there and what I had learned in South Carolina, so-called inferior school. But the teachers were excellent teachers. It was the same thing when I went to college. Sometimes you might not have some certain material to work with, but they gave you the theory and you could just apply it wherever you go. So we had some of the best teachers at Howard School, and I went there from first grade to 12th grade. At that time we had to rent our books, and your parents had to buy your papers and whatnot. So therefore, as soon as I got to be 12 years old, even before then, I sold the Afro-American in the Pittsburgh Courier. We were always trying to do something so that we'll get some money, spending money for activities at school, or in the summertime to really do something so we'll have enough money to get our books, because my parents could not buy all of those books the first or the second week of school. And I'm fortunate enough to bring them. As a matter of fact, probably you could take a picture of them. I have my books, my four readers, and I would like for you to see them before I leave here today, and you'll see why that I've always been conscious about and proud of my race, because I had these readers. They were black readers. She's the first Jean teacher. She taught other teachers. She was like a liaison between the teachers, the community, and the school. Now these books are very rare. This is the third grade reader. It's on Book of Washington. This is the Book of Washington School. And what I like about this one, I always remember, this one is from the Beck Elementary School. You probably got some old ones around here. This one is my fourth grade readers. You see all of those characters on there. When I was in fourth grade, I knew, but that's Crispus Attucks with the rock. He was the first one that died in the Revolutionary War, and we have all of these other people, Sojourner Truth, the doctor, and all of these people that we could mentor ourselves after. And at the end of this book, people think that we never knew anything but Africa. They have 2 stories on Africa. At a very early age, I knew I was going to go to college. When I was in 8th grade, Mrs. O came from South Carolina State College, where I attended, and I told her that I wanted to go to college, and I don't know whether my parents could afford it, but I would like to apply for a scholarship. So every year she would come, and we would talk, and sure enough, my senior year, she gave me the application, and I applied, and I got a small scholarship to go to South Carolina State, and that's where I graduated. That's where I met my husband. We've been married 54 years, and also got an excellent education there. And this was a predominantly black school. We have turned out some of the best people in the country. Clyburn was a class underneath me, and we listened to Gene Robinson on NB, yes. And he is from South Carolina State, and I could go on and on and on. And then I spent her summer at South Carolina State, and Thomas Robinson used to bring us home, and little did I know, I'm just going to throw this in right now, that that's Michelle Obama's uncle. And he ended up with a principal, being a principal of one of the schools in the county. So we have put out some excellent. Then when I was a little girl, then before I got to high school, would you believe that I played with Chubby Checker? He lived on Butt Street. If you'd come to my museum, I have a picture, and Chubby said, "To Bunny and the Butt Street Gang." And his name was Ernest Evans, and he was just great. He was always an entertainer. He came from Spring Gully, like we said, a country boy, and he would have on these bro gang shoes. And he'd have us singing and dancing. And my mother said, "Henry," his name is Henry, Ernest. He said, "Ernest have you all out there all sweaty and dusty and whatnot," but he was always an entertainer. Then I remember at Easter, you know, in the black churches, we have an Easter, we do recitation. That means that you will say an Easter speech, and you study for it, and you have to say it without reading it. And sometimes you could go on for 15 minutes, but it takes you like, you have to learn it. Like we said, learn it by heart. And he made his up. He was always a rapper, and it went like this. I had a little dog, and his name was Rock. I sent him to the store at a pack of snuff. Rock fell down and spilled that stuff, and he did this. He said, "Go on, Rock, I'm done with you." And he looked there like the dog was actually there. So another form of entertaining when I was coming up. Because it was unusual, you know, we'll say really something pertaining to God, crucifixion. And he came with, I mean, he was rapping then, and he was no more than about, we were probably about 10, 11 years old or what have you. Then when he left Georgetown, he went to Philadelphia. And someone told me one day, said, "You know who Chubby Checker is?" And I said, "No." And they says, "Ernest." And I thought, that is Ernest. After I came back home, and every time he would come over there and do Andrew's Good Time Day, and we'd go over and see him and speak to his mother and whatnot. So we have some famous people that came off of Butt Street. And the other thing that when I was a little girl, we would listen to Grandma Williams. Grandma Williams is the only enslaved African that I've ever met. When she died, she was about 105. She was off of Keithfield Plantation, so that's out there near the Plantersville area. And we would just sit around and listen to some of the stories that Grandma told us. And they will stay with us forever. She was not my, but all of us called her Grandma Williams. And I'll never forget the one that she said about the 13-bean soup, of the 23-bean soup, because she was a cook. We still have her pestle. You know, you have one back there, but we have Grandma. This is the one that Grandma used on the plantation. And she said, because she was a cook, a lot of times they would have beans or peas, and they would just take a handful and stick it in their pocket and whatnot, and they would take it to the slave quarters. And when they would get enough in a pot, and different kind, they would make the big pot of soup. Wow. She used to tell us beautiful stories. And it isn't stories like other people have recorded from somebody else. So I was very fortunate to have had to sit at Grandma Williams' feet. A lot of times she would tell us about how some of the guys would be whipped. And I'll tell you this one. I hope it isn't. And she said, if you know that you're going to be whipped, you know, African Americans know all kinds of herbs that you could use to do certain things. She said they would have them strung up with their hands like that. But the night before, they would take this herb because it's a laxative. So, because when he hit you the second time, if you were hanging up there, you could imagine what happened. And we would, you know, the way she told it, and we would be laughing, you know, because so that's one of them that she told. So, you know, a lot of times people say, oh no, you know, they were treated like this, and they're getting the interviews. A lot of times you would interview, white people would interview someone who have lived on the plantation, on this plantation, and they go and interview the person. We did not get anything but freedom. You're going to interview that person. They live on that plantation. And what are they going to say? Yeah, Massa been treating us good. Massa did this and I did this and the next thing. These were survival skills. They had to say that. But with Grandma Williams didn't have to say that to us. And it's the same thing that a lot of the writers who did the WPA writers, and the only place that I really liked what they say is, I think the only place that they had black writers was in the state of Virginia. Other than that, you have to watch it because I know what and how they say things. These were survival skills. I got the real story. The real story. It's another one that they would talk about. And I had a habit of, because at that time it was a culture, and if you look at an African village, there's never any grass, you know. And in my day, no one had any grass in their yards. So you would sweep the yards, grass was clear. And I would always listen to what adults would be talking about. They didn't know, but I would act like I'm doing some mathematics or spelling words and whatnot. And I would listen because I always like to hear stories. So I learned and I began to put some of those stories, remember them. As I get older, they begin to come back to me. And these are some of the things that, you know, these are some of the things that we did. I majored in home economics because everybody thought I was going to be a history major. But the reason I didn't go in history, they never had about 2 history teachers, and they were still going to be there, and they were there 20 years, 25 years after I left. But I had a teacher, and I always liked doing things with my hands. So Mrs. O'Kame, the lady that I told when I was in 8th grade, she was one of the people that impressed me, and she was in home economics, so I majored in home economics. Then, when I got married, then I went to Boston. My husband is from Boston. So I went to Boston, and after Boston, we were just up and down the East Coast. From Boston to Baltimore, from Baltimore back to Boston to Pennsylvania. And there were in between times, if he would transfer, I would come home and enroll the children in school here. Georgetown has always been my love. And I have to tell you the experience about the library. Some of the members know about my experience here at the library. A group of us, because we were smart, and we had Mrs. Sheldell, and she had given us this assignment. And even though we had a nice library, but this one, Georgetown Library, had more information in it, and we went there, and they told us that we couldn't use the library. And I never went back to the library again until I came back, I think in 1987. And I would bring I had 2 girls that graduated from Georgetown High. So that was something that really bothered me for a very long time. Not wanting to, well, it was one of those things. Because, you know, I'm just 3rd generation from slavery. My grandmother was first. We have our grandfathers, he was a cobbler on the plantation. We have his cobbler's bench. And my mother was just 2nd generation. And it even kind of hurt to talk about it because I was always one seeking knowledge. And I have a fantastic, my husband and I have a fantastic library at home. He uses the library, he'll do my research work. I guess all of it stemmed from turning us down. And we were just students looking for knowledge. When I went to New York in 1954, and I lived in Harlem with my sisters, and people thinking that it was heaven, but it wasn't, because blacks didn't own anything. They didn't own that much. And here in Georgetown, at that time, we had Peanut Elliott. He was a little millionaire. We had tailors, cobblers. We had people with small business on the street that, on Hawkins Street. You had one of the most thriving grocery store that actually delivered grocery. We had all of these things on the west side of Georgetown. Then was a cultural shock to me when I went up north, because in Georgetown is more segregated now than it was before, and especially the West End. And you need to do a story on it, because on the West End you had poor whites and poor blacks. You had what we call Khorasan Indians. They are Khorasan Indians from Lumberton, the Syrian and the Lebanese. All of those people lived on the west side of Georgetown. On this side of historical Georgetown, it was blacks and wealthy white people. A lot of poor white people did not live on this historical district, and they still don't to this day. So there was a cultural shock. When I went to Boston, we had all these school teachers. I was the 11th black school teacher in the system, in the whole city of Boston. But yet the blacks who were there, thinking that because they could go to white school, but you had in-house segregation. And actually the blacks in the South were getting a better education, and they were going to college. And we had banks, black-owned bank and institution, and North Carolina Mutual Insurance Company and insurance men. And when my children went to Baltimore from Boston, we live outside of Boston, that was the first time they had seen, they were all excited because it was black men were delivering mail. So after the civil rights movement in the South, the blacks up there realized that they were just as bad or worse off. And that's when it began to change, all of it. In Boston, they had Catholic, like we pronounce in the Gullah language, a Catholic community in the Catholic Church, Hungarian Catholic Church, Italian Catholic Church, and everybody lived in their own little neighborhood. Here, I was brought up where blacks and white lived next door to each other in Georgetown. Georgetown, Charleston, Beaufort. Because Georgetown was like over 90% black. Charleston was 80, and Beaufort was 85. So you had no other alternative but to live next door to each other. So I was brought up in a more diverse community. Now, not all of South Carolina, because when I went to South Carolina State, the children said, oh, in Bamberg, we had to walk down the street on one side of the street, and the white folks walk on the other side of the street. I remember when Belt's department store on Front Street put in that white water and colored water. So we always would walk over and see what the white water tastes like. And they took all of the water fountains out. Well, I was always in and out of Georgetown. I came back 14 years ago, and I had 2 daughters that graduated from Georgetown High. We came back to my father's funeral in '87, and they were so happy to see their cousins, and I guess being around black folks, and as we'd always live in a predominantly white area because of the nature of my husband's job. And so I said, yeah, you all could graduate, finish school. So they finished at Georgetown High. And to this day, they never went back to live up north. So that's, they liked it. And they just liked the way Southern people live, you know, the sweet tea, and the people we lived in, the last place we lived in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, in that area, Lehigh Valley. And people are very curt. You know, here they said, thank you, good morning. I always taught my children to say, good morning, good afternoon, yes ma'am, and everybody would say, a lot of times when people go up north, they say, oh, that's a Southern thing, but I didn't think so. I think it's just a habit of respect to say yes ma'am and no ma'am. I didn't think anything was wrong with it. So they just, when they came down here, they fit in well because they started speaking Gullah because they know they couldn't. So my husband says, why are they not speaking standard English? I says, well, they just switched over because the children said when they came, the cousins told them that they sound white and they dance white. So they were, so they wanted to fit in with their cousins. So and then when Ann would call, and Anna says, she was working at a Krispy Kreme, and she said, this is Krispy Kreme, and this is Anna speaking. And he says, you know, she was speaking standard English. But children can switch over like that, you know, they're good at that type thing. I taught until, because the nature of my husband's job, he became an attorney for Bethlehem Steel, and they would fly around to go to different mills. So then I realized I had to give up teaching because the children needed a full-time mother. So that's when I started using some of my skills in home economics, you know, making things and selling and opening up store. First I had it at the house, and then I opened up the business in Easton, but I always had a room for the children when that was their room, and so forth. But I continued to teach like different classes at the Y and whatever. And my husband says I'm always talking down to him. So I think when you're a teacher, you're forever doing it, you know, giving instruction and repeating it. So, when I came back to Georgetown, I had a business on Front Street until Hugo. It lasted, well, I was there 10 days and Hugo came, but I think I stayed a couple of years after that, but I don't think I would ever go back on Front Street. Because a lot of times they used to have this unusual high tide, and at that time they had not done anything with the sewage system, and a lot of times you'd have backup, you know. So yeah, I always wanted to open up, you know, I thought it was just great to open up something on Front Street, but it isn't all that glamorous. At the time I sold lace and other African artifacts, but I always did things pretending to the Gullah culture, because I'd always do shows in Beaufort and other areas. So when I decided to not retire, when my husband retired, we stayed in Pennsylvania 2 years, and then I said it's time for me to go home. A lot of people wanted me to come to open up my business in Beaufort County, and some had suggested Charleston, and I said, why should I go there? Georgetown is the epicenter of the Gullah culture. So I came home. Oh yeah, they talk about Hoover time and how bad it was, but I remember in 1945, we had the World War, and we had these, and I still have some, they'd give us stamps, and my parents got an awful lot because we had a lot of children, and your parents probably got an awful lot of those stamps too. And that's how we would buy our food, because they had rationed the food. I think the stamps' name were ration stamps or something like that, and then you would take it to the store. You had to use those stamps in order to get food. Now we had cousins who didn't have any children, and they would let them have a couple of the books so that they would be able to buy certain foods. Because even though, you know, most Gullah people eat rice every day, and if you want to, we could eat rice in the morning. But during World War II, I don't know how, I guess it was even worse during the Depression, because during World War II, a lot of times we couldn't eat rice. We'd have to, you know, they would grow potatoes and we would eat mashed potatoes with tomato sauce or ketchup on it, you know. But they talk about how hard it was. And so that I do remember, you know, the hard time that we had in World War II. I remember when the war ended. I also remember that they would have what they call blackouts. And you know, when you're a children, you think about things differently. And I really think that I thought that they would just, everything would just turn black during the day. But that wasn't it. What happened when you had a blackout, you couldn't light anything in the house, you know, everything had to be black, you know, because they'd have these airplanes or whatever flying around. And it was very scary. That was scary to me, Yeah, the whole house was just black. You couldn't see out of it. Everything was just black. The men were exceptional. And I always wondered why. My dad worked at International Paper Company. Before working at International Paper Company, he worked at the Atlantic Coastline. And after the Atlantic Coastline went out of business, that's when International Paper Company came. And I have quite a put of stories that Mr. Henry Smith wrote, that book that I'm doing on the west side about the Atlantic Coastline. Yeah, that was the lumber company. And they worked there, and they did an awful lot of manual work. Now, my dad worked at International Paper Company, and I remember the sad thing, and it would always bother me. He said how a student just out of Wynyard School would come to start work at International Paper Company, and they will take them through all of the training, give them all of the information. And he said in 6 months, they would make that young man a supervisor over them. And now I know why my dad and a lot of other men would drink on the weekend. Now they work hard all week, but they would drink on the weekend, because that is really something. You know, that was very something for them to, and they had to work there because they had to provide for these large families, because most of the families were very, 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 very large. And they worked very hard. And they would have some extra things, like my dad, at one time he had a little fish store. He was selling fish, and you know, and then some of them would also get a little part-time job. And but these men, you'll find, they worked very hard, knowing they could work, and a lot of them are 30, they could be working there 30 years, and they know they could do that same job and not get a promotion. But they did it. They sent their children to college. They built homes. They did whatever they could. But they were hard workers. The ladies worked right along with them. Now some of the men, like my uncle, some of them were stevedores over at the dock. And the thing about it then, a lot of times the ships didn't come in as regular. So what they would do, they would have to go to Wilmington to work in the Wilmington Port Authority, either go to Charleston. And that's why right now a lot of the people from the Georgetown area, they ended up living in the Wilmington because there was more work there. The ladies, phenomenal. They did whatever they could do. Like on Butt Street, Mrs. Georgia Capers would stretch curtains and make the little dollies with the, she took in that type thing, sugar, and they were all pretty and whatnot, standing up like that. Then Mrs. Malm on Butt Street and some of the other ladies would sell dinners to the men who worked at the dock, you know. And then my mother, I think she was in her late 30s, she went to St. Helena Island, to the Penn Center, and took up midwifing and became a midwife. All of these people did something. Then during World War II, a lot of the men went to the service. So these females were hired at International Paper Company. And I would like to do the research on those ladies. I know some of them who worked at International Paper Company. My mother had 6 children. My aunt had 6 children. They worked, it was a swing shift. I don't know how they did it. Because that's how, you know, it was the craft. They call it the craft then. And that's what they did. So they had to work those swing shifts. And they worked with children. Then they also didn't have enough females, so they brought in guys from the, black guys from the British Honduras, which now is, they're called Belize. But they brought them into Georgetown to work. Then what the men did, they had a way of recreation. A lot of them played baseball. Baseball was just great, you know. I think if we lived in big cities, everybody would want to be Joe Louis. but everybody wanted to be Jackie Robinson and Roy Campanella. So they played baseball. So International Paper Company provided a baseball field. And I didn't realize that I had seen some of the guys who played on the Negro baseball team would come to Georgetown because they came straight down the East Coast. They left Wilmington. When they left Wilmington, they came to Georgetown. They played the guys. They were practicing with them, I guess. And they pick up the best players, and then they would play Charleston, because a lot of times they would end up, the Negro baseball team would end up in Cuba. And then at the end of the season, the guys would come back home. But these people, these men and women, did whatever they could do. Then in the summertime, my grandmother and my aunt and other people, they would take people in either Lois or Table City, North Carolina, so we could work in green tobacco. We always worked as a family unit. You know, these people were extremely, I don't know how they did it, with all of the children, and they worked, male and female. When I get upset when they talk about women begin in the workplace. African American women have always, we came here, and you have old newspaper, you get some of those old newspaper, and they advertise for Negro slave and Negro winches. So we had to dig that canal out there in the Santee Canal, all the water coming. So we have always worked side by side. And we continued. We did it, and we continued after we got out of slavery, because you didn't have anything. The only thing we got is freedom. And some of us were fortunate that you didn't have to stay on the plantation and sharecrop, and that was even worse than slavery. So these people really worked, and these men were men. The females were phenomenal. Myrtle Grove is one of the cemeteries. The Gullah folks always call it Muckle Grove, but it's Myrtle Grove. And I don't think anyone have actually studied it. Georgetown was predominantly black. As one piece of land, they said that's where the slave graveyard was. There must be a lot of houses around here sitting on the top of a slave graveyard. And someone was wondering about that sinkhole. Well, I have my own thing about them sinkholes. Probably they began to act up. They're too close to the cemetery, and I'm quite sure they crazed through on this side too. That was the only one slave cemetery that I actually remember, because the one, I've heard them talk about the one, and it's nothing, had never been there, the one right on the corner where the Bank of America, right on the corner of Harmarket Street and Frazier Street. That's just a small space, because when a missionary back in the 1700s, beginning of the 1800s, when he got off of the ship, there were so many black people in Georgetown, and he said they were jungle-like sounds. They were different, from different African nations. He thought he was in Africa. So where are the graves? But Myrtle Grove was one of the plantations that's off of the Sampit River. And I remember exactly, because sometimes we would go out there, because the craft had a dump, and we'd go out to get wood, and actually we would actually put wood on the top of our head, and the only thing, if you're not used to doing it, it seemed as though my neck was going down in your body. And then you put it on and you take it off, but it was the quicker way of taking it. You couldn't take it in your arm, and we'd go out and get the small pieces for the stove. But then the craft dump was here, and it seemed like it was in between. The city dump at that time wasn't where it was out there next to International Paper Company dump, and it was. It seemed as though it was like a. It wasn't like a creek. It was like some water. Probably we could call it a creek between the two dumps, and then on the other side, and that graveyard was on the other side, either between those two or on the other side. It's been a long time, because a lot of times, you know, people get so they want to visit our graveyards all the time, and see, black folks didn't believe in going to the graveyards, because this is why we let it grow up, because we let the spirit rest, number one. Number two, if I had pointed where St. Stephen graveyard was, I had to bite my finger, that's the index finger, bite my finger, and then step on it, because the old folks said if you don't, it'll rot north. And I think that was just out of respect for the dead. So you don't, and walk over a grave, no. And do these little things and take whatever's on the mark, no, 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 no. To grave, and especially I'm very touchy about slave cemeteries and people going in there, because I figure that all of the work that they did and all of the hard time that they had, that they should rest in peace. When I went out to Friendfield Plantation, I had to tell the overseer, because we were taking some people from the National Park Service and tourists, that I didn't want anybody, you know, walking over the graveyard. And he was wondering why I was so close to water. But the Gullah people believe that the water brought us here. And if you have the cemetery near the water, the spirit, will take us back to Africa. That same big ditch that I was telling you about, we call it the big ditch. I was wondering why that ditch was so big. It was a canal, because that water came in, because when the water go out from the holding cell, you know, at the reservoir, it went out and it flowed right into the Sanford River. But I never knew, and you know, you live close to, you know, right by your house and Mrs. Pearlie Alley. That was what? A big ditch. That was a what? A canal. And all canals, to this day, you don't see any trees in the center of it. And no trees never grew up in those canals. It was the big ditch, rather. That's what it was. It was a canal. And on each side, and I think about it, you know, you could still, on the bank, it was like a little higher up and whatnot, and that was the bank, you know, the banks. And my dad used to say that why Howard School was always full of water, because it was a rice field. But he never really explained it to us, and a lot of our ancestors didn't. It was such a hard work in those rice fields, they never want to talk about it. Because my husband came, he thought it was Mr. Rice that owned that property where the Howard School is. But all of that, where you look, it was nothing but rice fields. You have to know about your past. We have to teach our children what the contribution of their ancestors. Like when I do the story quilt, and I start off with the first thing at the bottom, I start off with, it's a square with Egypt. Because when I was in sixth grade, I had my first class, like we would say in the Gullah language, in geography. And I always wanted to know about people, places, and things. And they said everything. Egypt was the cradle of civilization. Everything started in Egypt, your science, your mathematics, your physics, all of your culture. And towards the middle of that chapter, it said that Egypt was located in Asia Minor, not Africa. And a lot of times today, they will say that Egypt is located in northern Africa or the Middle East, not wanting to give Mother Africa any credit. Then the second one, it has, and I believe in that same square, I said, because we were talking about the Gullah culture, that they said Gullah was a mystery, and I said it is. I said Gullah is a language, it's a culture, and I also consider it a spirit. And I always says, and the pyramids and the Gullah people are out of Africa. When I move up to that second frame, I said the second frame represents where my ancestors and your ancestors, because in Hollywood, they have us all the time running around out in the jungle with no clothing on. And to this day, if they're doing a documentary on Africa, they would go to the most remote part of Africa to do that not a modern city. It's still making Africa like it's a bunch, like they said, salvage. They said Africa's a dark continent, it's a bunch of barbaric and salvage people came out of Africa. And I always remind my group, I said, you know one thing? And I says, a lot of times when I was small, probably I was ashamed, because who want to be from a place like that? And as I began to study my history from elementary school, and I realized that there are two countries that they talk about. And I said, I don't care whether you are Catholic, like we pronounce it, whether you're Jewish, whether you're Muslim, or whether you're Christian. All of us are familiar with that Old Testament. And in that Old Testament, together, over 700 times, they mention two countries, Egypt and Ethiopia. And they are located in Africa. They do not mention any Rome, Greece, or those places until the New Testament. And then certain days, if they get a little frigidity, and then some of them are shaking their head because they know their little Bible and they know their little history. And I says, you know, when they said that angel came and told Mary and Joseph, where did they tell them? They said, take baby Jesus and go to where? Egypt. And then when I get into the third one, there are three people there. And then so I'm explaining our culture, your Gullah culture. They made us ashamed of the first language that my ancestors put together and made it possible for me, you, Tony, and all of the others to survive. And I have three people, and it's a net coming down. And I said that net caused two things. It caused the separation, the breaking up of the African family when they were captured. And it also started us to speak in Gullah, because you got all kinds of books right here in this library. The first book is black border, and I want you to check it out. Ambrose Gonzalez. Everybody go to his book. He was the first one that wrote a book about Gullah. All of these people were folklorists. Mrs. Peterson, all of them are folklorists. They wrote stories about black folks and how we pronounce words and whatnot. They did not study the culture of the people. They made us ashamed. When I went to South Carolina State, all of the children from Georgetown, Charleston, and Beaufort stuck together because we spoke Gullah. We knew each other from participating in different school and athletic activities and whatnot. So when we got there, we knew each other. The people from the rest of the state looked down on us because we spoke Gullah. Now, we're bilingual. We will speak regular standard English in a standard situation. But when we got together, think careful, think you don't know. We're going to speak Gullah because we felt comfortable with each other. Now, when Ambrose Gonzalez said that we could not speak standard English because we had thick lips and broad noses, he wrote that book on the top of the 1900. Oh, he was a newspaper man because his people ran the state paper in Columbia. And I said to myself, old man Gonzalez should be alive today. Because some nights when I wake up, I see those girls trying to get this Botox so they could get these nice thick lips like we would say. And then he said, jungle-like sounds came out of our mouths. They did, because what happened was Turner was a black professor, PhD, in his 30s, visited South Carolina State because he was doing a summer program there. He heard the children from Georgetown, Charleston, and Beaufort. He was in language and history. He knew that it was not bad English, it was not broken English, that it was a language. He followed them home, boy home, and Jones Island. And then after he left there, he went to a seminar, and they were doing a seminar on the Gullah culture, on the dialects throughout America. Since he was black, he wrote a book and did his research work on Africanism in the Gullah dialect. He started his study in Georgetown. When I came back here, and some of the educated blacks wanted to tar, feather me, and run me out of Georgetown. Says bad English or broken English. Had not known that this man wrote this book, declared back in the 40s that Gullah was a language. He started his study right here in Georgetown County. I'm continuing to do his study. I need some people to help me. We're finding out the people who did the descendants of the Gullah people who he interviewed. So we will be looking for that. With that, it takes time and money, which the museum doesn't have, but Andrew and myself. So we continue, this is from Smithsonian, we continue to work on it, and this is something that happened 70 years ago. And after he left Georgetown, he went straight down to Florida. The other thing is, the other myth is that Gullah people live on an island. Less than 10% of Gullah people ever lived on the island. But all of this is from all of those people who were just writing about us, and it's even like Gullah folks have gotten wassa now. They really do write and put things on the internet that doesn't have anything to do. Incorrect information. Turner, when he left Florida, he went to London to the School of Oriental and African Study, because you didn't have any schools with African studies over here to learn the West African languages. After he left London, he went to Africa. And when he came back, he had over 4,000 words that we were still using. He said that Gullah people were using an African grammar, word order, and syntax. When the Africans were captured, Turner said, they would be between 216 and 75 different tribes and nation of people. They couldn't understand each other. These people were highly intelligent. They put words, they said, we got to put some words together so that we'll be able to communicate with each other. Sometimes they were coming through the interior of Africa, pulling somebody half dead or dead, or could you give me a glass of water? Just help me out. They started putting words together. It never started here. All of those old historians, they said, oh, it started because they didn't want the planners to understand what they were talking about. The overseer was teaching them baby talk. How could the overseer teach them baby talk, but that many different ethnic group, different tribes on the plantation, when he was at the end of that, that economic and educational ladder himself? And then some would say, they're this and they're that, and how it started. It started on the continent of Africa, and we were like any other ethnic group who have ever come here. And this is an English-speaking country. They're going to speak in their own language, and they begin to add English words to their vocabulary. One of the other Africanism that we still carry with us. We need to study all the Africanism that we have. I do have several. My mother was a midwife. There are things that they would do for birth control that they talk about, and it was just a method of birth control. We have brought it, and it is still with us. And Gullah is the only thing that they left us. We could not own any land or anything, and they left us this great gift that people made us ashamed of, and it's called Gullah Geechee.